The temperature was 41 above zero at 10 o'clock on the morning of January 12, 1888 in Custer County, Nebraska. Farmers were out in their fields. School children had walked to class without coats. A Methodist circuit preacher named Amos Kettlewell was riding horseback between homesteads, remarking to no one in particular that it felt almost like spring. 12 miles to the northwest, a woman named Marta Szymanski was standing on the roof of the strangest structure in 3 counties, pressing her hand flat against a wall made almost entirely of stacked prairie straw and laughing bee. 'Cause for the 4th time that week, a neighbor had ridden past and shaken his head. She didn't care. She had been laughed at since the day she filed her claim. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the temperature would drop 63 in under an hour. Wind would reach 70 meters an hour. Every conventional shelter in that valley, the standard issue frame shacks, the thin-walled claim shanties, the one-board thick constructions that passed for houses on the Nebraska prairie would begin killing people. Children would freeze to death within a quarter mile of their own front doors. Grown men would be found dead in snow drifts the following morning, packed in so tight the cold had stopped them where they stood. Marta Szymanski's house would hold 41 of interior warmth through the worst 12 hours of what history would remember as the school children's blizzard. 41, the same number as the pleasant morning temperature outside before the storm. The irony of that number wouldn't be lost on a single person who survived to notice it. To understand what Marta built, you have to understand what she was building against. The Homestead Act had been promising free land since 1862. By 1887, the wave of settlement that followed had turned Custer County into a patchwork of claims, some thriving, most struggling, a significant number already abandoned. The land was free. Everything else cost money that most settlers simply didn't have. Marta had arrived in Nebraska in the spring of 1886 with 2 children, $11.40, a broken wagon repaired with wire, and a letter from a cousin in Kearney who had since moved back to Pennsylvania. Her husband, Joseph, had died of typhoid in a Chicago boarding house 4 months earlier. She was 34 years old. She spoke English with a thick Polish accent, and she had absolutely no intention of dying on the prairie. She filed her claim on 160 acres in Custer County in April. The quarter section sat along a shallow draw that collected a reliable trickle of water 6 months out of the year. A neighbor named Heron Briggs, a broad-shouldered Ohio man who'd been working his own land since 1872 and considered himself something of an authority on frontier survival, studied the parcel with her and told her 3 things. First, the water would dry up in August. Second, the draw would flood in spring. Third, she wouldn't last the winter. He wasn't being cruel on the Nebraska plains in 1887. That was just being straightforward. Marta thanked him, nodded, and spent the next 2 weeks walking every inch of her land. What she was looking for was building material. That was the fundamental problem of settling the Central Plains. There was almost no timber. The grandstands of hardwood that Eastern settlers had taken for granted simply didn't exist here. You could haul lumber from the rail at a price that would break a poor family, or you could find something else. Most settlers cut sod. Marta had seen those sodas going up along the creek bottoms, thick-walled, dark, perpetually damp, smelling of earth and worms. She did not want to build a sod house. This wasn't sentiment. Marta wasn't a sentimental woman. She had outlasted a Chicago winter in a single room shared with 4 other families. What she was thinking about was heat. A sod house leaked warmth through every crumbling joint between the cut blocks. It bred moisture that rotted anything stored inside it. She had heard stories in Kearney from survivors of the Great Die-Up Winter of 1886. 300,000 cattle dead across the northern plains because shelters hadn't been ready and the cold had come fast. She was thinking about insulation. She just didn't have a word for it yet. What she had was 17 acres of thick blue stem prairie grass standing 6 feet high in her lower field. She had a baling press borrowed from a neighbor named Tobias Frenzel, a German immigrant carpenter who had built what he considered an excellent house. from milled lumber hauled 40 miles from the railhead, and who viewed Marta's grass operation with the polite contempt of a skilled tradesman watching someone improvise badly. "That won't keep anything out," he told her, leaning against his fence. "Straw is for animals. You need wood." Marta looked at the price of wood. She had $2.85 left after seeds and tools. She began baling. The bales she produced measured approximately 18 in thick and 36 in long, tight-packed enough that a full-grown man could stand on one without compressing it more than A4 in. She stacked them in a running bond pattern, the same offset stagger a mason uses with bricks, with each course set back 2 in to create a slight inward lean that would resist the lateral pressure. She drove wooden stakes through from top to bottom at 30 inches intervals, pinning the courses together between the bales. She packed a mixture of clay soil and ground dried grass. When it dried, it became harder than the surrounding bale material and completely windproof. The walls were 22 in thick. For comparison, the standard frame shack going up all over Custer County that season had walls approximately 1 in thick. Some of the better-built claim houses had reached 4 in with interior sheathing. Marta's walls were 22 in of tightly compressed grass with clay-packed joints. The first thing she had done differently was orient the structure the 17 angle off the standard grid. Everybody noticed. Nobody could figure out why. The reason was wind deflection. She had stood in her lower field in a northwest gale and watched the grass bend in a curved wave that spilled around the draw's natural contour. She was building her walls to match the wind's preferred path rather than block it head-in. Harlan Briggs came to look when the walls were chest-high. He walked around twice, said nothing, then pressed his thumb hard into a clay joint. "Nothing. Gabe, that's an awful lot of work," he said finally. "For something that's going to rot in the first wet spring." "It won't rot," Marta said. He looked at her the way experienced people look at inexperienced people when they're being polite about their doubt. Everything rots, especially straw. He was not wrong exactly. Wet straw rots with remarkable speed. But Marta had already solved this problem. She built the eaves out 24 in on every side, creating a shadow line that kept direct rainfall off the wall faces. The roof pitch she set at 52, nearly a third steeper than anyone else in the valley was building. Rain shed instantly. Snow loaded briefly and slid before the weight accumulated. The whole structure, including the roof framing, which she did build with milled lumber, spending $240 of her remaining money, cost $3.20 total. The remaining 80 cents she kept in a tin box under the sleeping platform. Tobias Frenzel, who had spent $67 building his own house, did not find this funny. If you want to subscribe to this channel where we document forgotten frontier techniques and the people who use them, clears throat, now is the time. Every week, we bring you the actual history of American survival. Real numbers, real stakes, real people. Hit that subscribe button and join thousands who believe this knowledge is worth preserving. Now, let's get back to Marta. Reverend Kettlewell stopped by when she was fixing a repaired corner of the roof framing. He was a lean, weathered Kentucky man who had been riding circuits on the Nebraska prairie for 9 years and had seen more frontier construction than most carpenters. He studied the wall with genuine curiosity and asked, "How do you plan to heat something that thick? The heat won't penetrate." Marta looked at him. "That's the point," she said. Kettlewell sat down on a bale and thought about that for a full 2 minutes. He was working through the difference between a wall that lets cold in and a wall that keeps warmth from leaking out. The standard claim shanty was terrible at both. Thin boards that let outside air pour through every gap, forcing you to run a stove hard enough to replace heat as fast as it escaped. Marta's walls didn't leak. The warmth she generated stayed put. You didn't need as much because you weren't constantly replacing what you'd already burned. "How do you keep the inside from getting too warm in summer?" he asked. "It won't," she said. "The walls hold the cold, too, from the night. I close everything up in the morning. It stays 62 inside until midday in August." He stared at her, then very carefully. "Mrs. Szymanski, I think most of your neighbors are going to think you've lost your mind." "Yes," she said. "I know. He laughed a short surprised sound. He liked her immediately. He would remember this conversation for the rest of his life. By late autumn of 1887, there were 9 family homesteads within 4 miles of Marta's claim, and they watched her building project with a mixture of amusement, skepticism, and a faint undercurrent of something none of them would have named as anxiety. The anxiety came from a simple fact. They had all built conventional houses, and the winter of 1887 to 1888 was already being talked about in the Kearney newspapers as potentially severe. The signs that experienced prairie people read: the thickness of caterpillar fur, the height at which squirrels were caching food, the particular way the October wind came from the northwest rather than the west. We're reading like a bad story. Nellie Warwick had read those signs. Nellie was 47 years old and had been on the Nebraska prairie since 1869. She had survived 3 genuine blizzards, 2 drought years, and a grass fire that consumed 11 square miles in 4 hours. She was the most respected homesteader in the valley, and she had been watching Marta's construction with greater attention than she let on. In November, she came to Marta's finished house and asked to be shown through it. Marta took her through every detail. The diagonal door entry, a wind baffle created by cutting the opening at an angle through the wall, so that cold air couldn't surge straight through when the door opened. The crown beam that distributed the roof's load evenly across the bale surface, the clay joints, the roof pitch. Nellie ran her hand along the interior wall, which Marta had plastered white with a lime clay mix. She pressed her palm flat against it, felt the particular stillness that a thick wall has, the absence of vibration, the sense of mass. How much wood do you burn overnight? Nellie asked. 11 pounds, Marta said. Maybe 12 in January. Nellie turned and looked at her directly. Harlan Briggs burned 60 pounds a night. Yes, Marta said. I know. There was a silence outside. The November wind pressed against the south wall. It sighed and poked, looking for gaps. There were no gaps. Marta's house sat around them like a held breath. Can you build another one of these? Nellie said. Fast. How fast? I think we have maybe 6 weeks. Marta studied her. Nellie Warwick was not given to exaggeration. I can build the walls in 3 weeks if I have help. She said. I'll get you help, Nellie said. This is the kind of conversation that never makes it into history books, because nobody thought to write it down, and yet, this is exactly where history happens. 2 women standing in a building that smells of dried grass and fresh clay doing arithmetic about survival in the space between one sentence and the next. 3 families said yes. The Packerney family, Czech immigrants, Father John and Mother Algida with 2 teenage sons, had nothing built yet and had been sheltering in a dugout slowly filling with underground seep water. They said yes before Nellie finished asking. Samuel Okafor, a freedman from Tennessee, who had homesteaded in Custer County with his wife Agnes and his elderly mother, said yes after 1 day's thought. And Hester Lund, a Norwegian widow, 51 years old, who had survived a Norwegian mountain winter and 2 Great Plains winters, looked at Marta's house with the evaluating eye of someone who had been cold in serious ways, and said yes immediately, then went home and started cutting bales, working together with Marta directing and the Packerney boys doing the heavy stacking. They raised walls for 3 additional houses in 22 days. The construction moved faster because Marta had learned efficiencies the first time: how to pre-cut and pack the joint material, how to drive stakes most efficiently, how to cut the diagonal door entry with minimal waste. The Packerney and Okafor houses went up in 7 days each. Hester Lund's house, which she insisted on building slightly larger, 20 to by 15 feet of interior space, took 9 days. Total material cost for all 3 houses under $12. Harlan Briggs watched the last walls go up from a distance of 200 yards and did not say a word. Tobias Frenzel dismounted at the Packerney house when the walls were chest high and examined the construction with professional attention for 20 minutes. He pressed joints, tested stake alignment, studied the corner bracing Marta had developed, diagonal stakes at each corner to resist racking forces in high winds, He nodded very slightly, remounted, and rode away without saying anything. This was, from Tobias Frenzel, the equivalent of considerable praise. The houses were finished December 18th. The 4 families moved in within the week. The temperature dropped to -14 on December 27th. Marta burned 11 pounds of wood that night and woke to an interior temperature of 53. Chester Almeida, to claims to the east, burned 73 pounds and woke to an interior temperature of 31. January came. The sky had the color and texture of pewter for 2 weeks running. The snow that had fallen since November was packed hard and going nowhere. The draw that Harlan Briggs had said would dry up in August had indeed dried up in August and had also frozen into a serviceable ice source that Marta was cutting into 20-pound blocks and storing in a root cellar she had dug adjacent to the north wall of her house. The north wall's coolness kept the cellar between 28 and 32 through December. Without any additional effort, she was not running experiments. She was just living in a house that worked. January 12, 1888 dawned warm. This should have been suspicious. It wasn't, or not to most people. Settlers had learned to be grateful for warmth whenever it appeared. The temperature at sunrise was 27, cold, but not bitterly so. By mid-morning, it had climbed to 41. The air was still. The sky was a pale, thin blue that didn't quite look like any other January blue. The children walked to the schoolhouse without their heaviest coats. Reverend Kettlewell set out on horseback to make afternoon calls. Chester Almeida's oldest boy, 13 years old, was sent to carry eggs to the Warwick farm a mile and a half away. Harlan Briggs was out mending fence on his west line, his coat tied behind his saddle. Marcia was on her roof. She had gone up to check the chimney cap, which had developed a slight lean in the December winds. She was pressing it back into alignment with a wooden mallet when she looked up at the northwest horizon and stopped moving. The cloud bank was already above the horizon line, not approaching, simply there in the way that plain storms can seem to materialize rather than advance. It had that particular density that experienced prairie people recognized as something different from ordinary overcast. A vertical compressed quality, like a wall being raised rather than a ceiling being lowered. The color was wrong, not gray, but green-gray at the base and white-gray at the top, and the top was moving fast. Marta was down off the roof in 90 seconds, inside in another 30, pulling her children, 11-year-old Katerina and 8-year-old Potter, away from whatever they were doing, telling them in rapid polish to put on everything they owned. She was lighting the stove. She was pulling the interior shutters across the 2 small windows. She was barring the door. She did not know the temperature was about to drop 63 in less than an hour. She did not know the wind would reach 70 meters an hour. She did not know this storm would kill approximately 500 people across Nebraska, Dakota, and Minnesota. She knew what the horizon looked like, and that was sufficient. What she did know was that her walls were 22 in thick. Her door was a double-baffled diagonal entry that no wind had found a way through. Her stove was lit and drawing cleanly, and she had 0 pounds of dry wood stacked against the south interior wall. She knew her chimney cap was now straight and her roof pitch would shed snow. Before accumulation became dangerous, she was ready. The storm hit the valley at 217 in the afternoon. Marta heard it arrive, not a gradual escalation, a wall of sound that struck and then kept striking. A sustained physical impact audible as a massive inhalation followed by a roar that didn't stop. The house shuddered, not structurally. The walls didn't move. The shudder was more like vibration, the way a large bell responds at the first strike. Then the roar settled into a continuous scream that would last 12 hours without meaningful pause. If you followed this story this far and you believe this kind of history deserves to be preserved, the real numbers, the real stakes, the real names, this is the moment to subscribe to this channel. Help us keep documenting what the frontier actually looked and felt and sounded like. Subscribe now and let's get back to that night. Inside Marta's house, the stove was holding at 68 degrees when the storm arrived. She had been heating since she came in from the roof. As the outside temperature fell toward -20, she added wood methodically. one split log every 40 minutes. She was counting burns. She had enough for 16 hours. At that rate, Katana sat on the sleeping platform doing arithmetic for school. Work. Potter had fallen asleep. The stove ticked and breathed. The walls pressed back against the storm. 2 miles away, the situation was different. Chester Almeida's frame shack, with its wooden walls, had begun hemorrhaging heat within 10 minutes of the storm's arrival. The gaps in the shiplap boards were now admitting a continuous infiltration of wind-driven snow that accumulated on the interior walls and floor. And as it melted from the stove's heat, it made the floor wet and then cold. Almeida and his wife and 4 children were burning wood as fast as they could split it. By 6 o'clock, with the storm still at its peak, the interior temperature of their house was 33. They were wearing everything they owned and still cold. Harlan Briggs had not made it back from his west fence before the storm hit. He found the Warwick barn by following his horse, which had a better sense of direction in a whiteout than any human. He was safe, but his horse had taken a wire cut in the zero visibility snow, and Briggs himself had a frostbitten right ear and 2 fingers that would ache in cold weather for the rest of his life. Reverend Kettlewell, caught between claims, had made the decision to stop moving and shelter in place. He crawled under his horse. The animal lay down, either by instinct or exhaustion, and covered himself with his horse blanket for 6 hours until the storm's worst had passed. The horse survived. Kettlewell survived with frostbite on both feet that would cost him to toes. He would describe those 6 hours for the rest of his life as the longest he had ever spent, the quietest, and the most genuinely uncertain. Chester Almeida's oldest boy had reached the Warwick house just before the storm broke. He was safe. The eggs in his coat pocket had frozen solid before he arrived. The Packerney family straw house stayed at 51 through the storm's peak. Jan Packerney burned 44 pounds of wood over 12 hours, compared to Harlan Briggs's typical 60 pounds on an ordinary cold night. The O'Kafer family held at 46. Slightly cooler because Samuel O'Kafer had left a small ventilation gap in his door baffled that Martu would seal for him the following week. He burned 38 pounds through the night and never felt seriously at risk. Hester Lunn's house stayed at 58 through the worst of the storm. She burned 31 pounds of wood. At about 4 in the morning, when the storm was easing from a howl to a sustained groan, she made herself a cup of tea and sat by her stove, reading a Norwegian Bible she had carried from home. Not a single person in his straw house was hurt. The morning of January 13th broke clear and desperately cold, -23 at sunrise. A brilliant hard sun turning the snow into a landscape of broken mirrors. The drifts were enormous, 12 and 14 feet, against the southwest faces of structures, tapered back on the northeast like frozen waves. Marta came out at first light and stood in the snow up to her thighs, looking around. Her roof had shed its load cleanly. The walls showed no damage. The clay joints had held. The diagonal door entry had a drift immediately outside the outer door, but nothing had gotten through the baffle to the inner door. The chimney cap was still straight. The first person to reach her was Nellie Warwick, walking with Harlan Briggs, whose frostbitten ear was wrapped in cloth torn from his shirt. He stopped 20 feet from Marta's house and looked at it. The undamaged walls, the clean roof line, the complete absence of structural damage. He looked at Marta. "What was your temperature last night?" "Interior 41 when I woke up." She said about 3 o'clock in the morning. "I added wood, it came back up." Briggs was quiet. He was a man who had spent 15 years on the plains and believed he knew what worked and what didn't. And he had been wrong about this in a way that could have mattered very badly to several people. That knowledge was sitting on him visibly. "How much did you burn?" he asked. 96 pounds total, she said. For the whole night, his own house had burned 211 pounds. His wife, alone through the storm, had kept the interior at 38 degrees by burning almost continuously. She was unhurt, but she had been frightened in a way she hadn't been since 1880. Harlan Briggs looked at the straw walls, at the smooth plastered interior visible through the open door, at the small column of smoke still rising from the straight, Chimney cap, he was doing the math, 96 pounds versus 211, 22 in of wall versus 1 in of board. 41 interior versus 38 on a night when the outside had hit -23. How long would it take to add straw wall insulation to an existing frame house? He said. Margia looked at him. This was not an apology. Harlan Briggs was not a man who apologized directly. This was better than an apology. This was a practical question, which meant he was already past the point of debating whether she had been right. Depends on the house, she said. A standard claim shack. Maybe for days if you have help. I'll have help, he said. Nellie Warwick, standing at Marta's shoulder, said nothing. But there was a quality to her silence that was the equivalent of several paragraphs. Chester Almeida came 3 days later. His family was unhurt but shaken. He didn't bother with preamble. I want to do what you did. Can you teach me? Yes, Marta said. What will it cost? Work, she said. Mine, then yours. He nodded. That was the currency of the frontier, and he understood it perfectly. Tobias Frenzel came a week after. He examined Marta's walls again with the attention of a skilled craftsman, working out the mechanics of something he hadn't built himself. He paid particular attention to the corner bracing and the crown beam connection. The joinery is crude, he said, not unkindly, just accurately. Yes, Marta said, but it held. I could do this better, he said. I'm sure you could, she said. He looked to see if that was sarcasm. It wasn't. She meant it exactly. He was a better carpenter, and they both knew it. And none of that changed the fact that her walls had been 22 in thick during the worst blizzard in Nebraska's recorded history. I'll build one for the Reinhardt family on the North Claim, he said, finally. They have nothing adequate. I'll help you, Marta said. He looked slightly startled. He had expected to be doing her a favor. He recalibrated. Good, come Monday. The Reinhardt house went up in 11 days. Combining Frenzel's precise joinery with Marta's design logic into something genuinely better than either had produced alone. The corners were tighter, the crown beam connection was cleaner. The diagonal door entry was refined to include a small interior bench for removing snow-covered outer garments. Before entering the main room, Frenzel added deep window reveals that let more light in while maintaining the insulative value of the thick wall. Marta added an additional layer of clay plaster in a technique she had learned watching Agnes Alliper, who had grown up making clay plastered walls in Tennessee and applied the skill with a fluency that made the Szymanski original look like a first draft. By spring of 1888, there were 11 straw Wallaces in Custer County. By 1890, the technique had spread to 3 adjacent counties and been written up in the Kearney Daily Hub as a new construction method for the prairie. The article mentioned the success of the style without naming Marta. It referred to her only as a woman homesteader of Polish extraction. She kept the newspaper. It is still in the possession of her great-great-granddaughter who lives in Lincoln, Nebraska. The physics of what Margia built were not formally understood until much later, but they were real and measurable. Modern building science calls what she achieved continuous insulation. The R value of a tightly packed straw bale wall, the measure of resistance to heat flow, is approximately R30 per foot of thickness. Marta's 22 in walls provided roughly R55 of total insulative value. The standard 1 in frame shack of 1887 provided somewhere between R2 and R3. That difference meant Marta's house was losing heat at roughly 5% of the rate. Her neighbors' houses were. Every log Chester Almeida burned trying to stay warm. Marta was achieving the same result with 1/12 of the fuel. The technique she had independently developed is now called straw bale construction, recognized by modern engineers as one of the most efficient low-technology building methods ever documented. The Nebraska Sand Hills were the first place in North America where it was practiced systematically. The first documented straw bale structures in North American history were built there in the 1880s. Within a decade of this story, researchers at the University of Nebraska have tested the thermal performance of historic straw bale walls and confirmed insulative values consistent with what Marta's neighbors experienced on the night of January 12, 1888. The cultural parallel is striking. Adobe in the American Southwest, ram earth in Northern Africa, cob walls in Wales and Ireland. The PBLO people of the Colorado Plateau had understood that a thick wall retains warmth differently than a thin one. Since before Europeans reached the continent, what Marta Szymanski discovered on the Nebraska prairie in 1887 was something human. Beings in resource-limited environments have been discovering and rediscovering across centuries. Mass, not just barrier, is what protects you from extreme weather. The wall that stops cold is one thing, the wall that holds warmth is another thing entirely. And the second wall is the one that keeps you alive. Harlan Briggs added straw bale insulation to his existing frame house that March and April, working with his two sons. His house, which had previously required 60 to 80 pounds of wood on cold nights, settled to 35 to 40 pounds after the insulation went on to cords of wood per winter. He no longer had to cut, haul, split, and stack. He rode to Marta's house in early May when the prairie was greening up and the draw was running water, and the world smelled like the particular earth and green smell of a Great Plains spring. He came alone. He sat his horse at the edge of her yard for a moment before dismounting, looking at the house, still solid, still clean, the white plastered interior visible through the open door, the chimney cap still straight. Marta came out and waited. "I was wrong," he said, not apologetically, just as accurate accounting. "I know," she said, also not unkindly, "just accurate." He nodded. He looked out at the draw at the green grass already coming up along the meltwater's edge. 14 more families coming into this valley this summer from the land office. He said, "I told them to come talk to you first before they build anything." She said, "Before they build anything." He said. He got back on his horse and rode north without another word. He was not comfortable with gratitude given or received, and he had said what he came to say. Marta watched him go. She stood in her doorway. In the doorway of her diagonal entry, baffled tunnel through 22 in a pressed prairie grass. In the doorway of the house that had cost $3.20 and kept her children at 41 through a blizzard that killed 500 people. She was 36 years old. She had 160 acres of Nebraska prairie, a root cellar full of food, and a working knowledge of how to keep people alive. In it, the school children's blizzard of January 12, 1888 killed a confirmed minimum of 235 people in Nebraska alone, with total deaths across affected states estimated between 400 and 500. The majority of victims died within short distances of shelter, some within yards of their own front doors, disoriented in zero visibility conditions that turned familiar ground completely alien. The speed of the temperature drop was the storm's most lethal characteristic, because it caught people outside without adequate clothing and moved too quickly for many to reach safety. The straw bale houses in that Custer County draw are not recorded in the storm's casualty documentation because none of their occupants were casualties. Reverend Kettlewell, who lost his toes to frostbite, and who had once sat on one of Marta's unfinished bales and thought for 2 minutes about what it meant that a thick wall kept warmth in rather than just cold out, wrote about the storm in his circuit journal. His entry for January 13, 1888 ends with a single sentence. Mrs. Szymanski's house was as she said it would be sufficient. Tobias Frenzel went on to build 7 more straw bale structures in Custer County before 1895, each incorporating refinements that combined his carpentry precision with Marta's original logic. He never claimed the design as his own. When people asked where he had learned the technique, he said Marta Szymanski's name clearly and without qualification, which from a man of his particular professional pride was a form of respect that everyone who knew him understood. Agnes Okafor's clay plaster technique spread laterally through the community. The way survival knowledge has always moved on the frontier by demonstration, by necessity, by the irreplaceable weight of having watched something work when it mattered most. Marta Szymanski proved up on her homestead claim in 1891, receiving her patent deed after 5 years of residence and improvement. She farmed the land until 1912 and then deeded it to her daughter Katsina, who had been 11 years old on the night of the blizzard, and who remembered clearly the particular quality of warmth inside those thick walls while the world outside went white and murderous. The original straw house stood until 1923 when it was pulled down, not because it had failed, but because the family wanted a larger structure. The walls, when they were opened, were found completely intact. No rot, no structural degradation, no loss of the clay joint material that Marta had ground by hand and between to flat stones 36 years earlier. The bales themselves had compressed slightly over the decades, but remained solid and coherent. A local newspaper ran a brief article about the demolition. It described the walls as remarkably preserved and of unusual construction, and mentioned that the original builder had been a woman. It did not give her name. She built what she built because she had no money and a clear eye and to children who needed to be warm. She used what the land gave her because the land gave her very little else. She didn't do it to prove a point or win an argument or be remembered. She did it because it was November in Nebraska and the walls needed to go up before the cold came. The cold came anyway, it always does, and the walls held. That's the only measure that ever mattered on the frontier. And if you think about it, really sit with it for a moment. It might be the only measure that matters anywhere in any era in any kind of building. Not the sophistication of the material, not the cost, not what it looks like from a distance, just whether it holds when the storm arrives, just whether the people inside stay warm. If you've made it this far in this story, you're the kind of person who believes this history deserves to be preserved, not as nostalgia, but as a living record of what human beings are capable of when they think clearly about hard problems. With limited resources, the knowledge Marta used didn't come from a book. It came from observation and logic and the specific intelligence the frontier required. That intelligence is worth documenting and keeping. Hit the like button if this story is worth sharing, and subscribe to this channel to stay with us as we find these people and tell their stories the way they deserve, in full, with their names, with the numbers that prove what they did, and with the respect that time has too often withheld from them. The grass in the Custer County draw is still there. It still bends in the northwest wind in that same curved wave she studied before she decided how to angle her walls. It still has an R value of approximately R30 per foot if you pack it tight enough. It's still waiting for someone with clear eyes and $3.20 and enough common sense to see what's already there.